you guys see my screen okay? Yes.
Yeah, we can see your Gmail.
Okay, nice. Um, all right, let's see. Let me just pull it up. And I I'm just getting used to Google Slides again because I no longer have access to Microsoft. The present is over here. Okay. Um, yeah, I guess yeah, happy to be here. I hope everyone's arriving okay. And yeah, it is nice that it's the weekend. And I think there's a lot to discuss, potential or a lot of potential threads maybe. So I'll try and not spend too much time on the conversation. But yeah, um I guess we'll just see how it goes and um looking forward to discussion or whatever, yeah, whatever comes up. Um, so I haven't attended all of the presentations from Life Itself that have been happening, I guess, the past few months, but I've attended most of them, I guess, and these are some of the themes that I think have come up more or less, or some of the very broad themes of the topics or of the calls. How do we consider our relationship to nature, especially in a mass extinction? Resilience in, I guess, civilizational collapse. Creating a regenerative knowledge commons. Insights from from Mark's journey, which was very, very insightful. Um, and the word that stood out for me was systems phenomenology. I talked a little bit with Mark about that, but this idea that um, well, just like something he mentioned where you kind of understand a system by experiencing it kind of. Um, Cultural and scientific paradigm shifts from Jonah and the talk on Bordeaux, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, from Martin, which again was very insightful. Kind of went over these themes of social structure, our place in it, and potential transformation. Um, and yeah, some of the questions that were kind of being explored in these presentations are here. For example, what is society? How does it work? How can it be changed? How to create a regenerative knowledge commons? Um, yeah, these kinds of questions, making sense of the difference between cultural and scientific paradigm change. Um, yeah, these are some of the questions that are kind of floating in the group, I guess, more or less. And these are some of the ones that I'll kind of focus on today. Creating a regenerative knowledge commons, making sense of the difference between cultural and scientific paradigm change, how to be consciously involved in the making or transformation of the world, and the capacities required for social transformation, societal transformation. And I guess there's not like necessarily one question that we're focusing on, but I think this last one is really kind of something that a lot of the talks focus on, or a lot of the discussions are focusing on what are the capacities required for societal transformation. And how are those embodied and maybe even how those are potentially embodied within our own group. So I'll kind of touch on that today too, if I can. Um, and I guess just a little bit more about the context of this group, or maybe, yeah, just about the context. I really personally do see this kind of dialogue as good in and of itself without necessarily saying like we're trying to get here or this is our end goal or this is our aim. Um, yeah, I really see these kinds of discussions as good in and of itself, and I think it's something that I would like to continue doing, whatever form it might take in the future. Um, yeah, and I guess just exploring maybe in another session how maybe this group is trying to find the relationship of um, how this is kind of a place to get feedback on our own research, or maybe building something together, and where we think our, this Friday group kind of fits in with that. So maybe, and yeah, these kinds of questions. And I guess there is this April retreat coming up, so kind of maybe if you guys think it might be a good idea to kind of do like some kind of sense making around these questions, and especially informed by a lot of the things that a few weeks ago Martin was bringing up, these more self-reflective things, because I think those are extremely important. But I guess recently, I think in my own personal life, I've kind of just been getting more involved again in the past few weeks, just because I was a bit busy with school and other things. So, um, but I do think that those questions are kind of uh, omnipresent, or always things that we need to come back to, or have rich potential. So maybe sometime in the near future, some kind of like a sense making session around these kinds of questions. Um, but one way that I consider, I mean, I guess this space or our own kind of, yeah, projects or discussions, and maybe what I'm doing, the way that I kind of consider these processes or these practices, is this, I guess, transition in being, knowing, and valuing. I guess maybe on different scales as well, whether that's an individual scale or a social scale, or uh, global scales, whatever the scales might be, cultural scales, whatever scale you think might make sense. This kind of being, knowing, valuing, and making sense of this transition, and how to talk about it, and how to consider it, and probably most importantly, how to embody this potential transition, of being, knowing, and valuing, how to make sense of it. Yeah, without necessarily falling into certain traps, or I guess trying to find the right relationship with these things, I guess, in theory and in practice. Um, and maybe you could tell based on my talk that it's a bit more focused on the knowing section, what knowledge production is, what it means to know. So these are kind of some of the questions that I might um, or would like to pose to the group today. This kind of more of a focus on knowing. Um, but at the same time, I think, yeah, I don't, it's about the entanglement of the three, or how the three are connected. So I definitely don't want to repeat this uh, um, idea that knowing is separate from being, separate from valuing, that they're kind of all together engaged in some way, and trying to make sense of how they're engaged, I think, is my personal way of considering some of the conversations we're having, or some of the conversations that others are having, potentially, or just my own maybe research. This kind of interaction with kind of a focus on knowing, but without it's a bit of a hard balance, I guess, because you kind of want to focus on one thing, but trying to keep in mind that it involves both being and valuing. Um, so yeah, how can there be a deepening of the three? How to reconsider knowledge and knowing in relation to being and valuing. Um, I think everybody is probably pretty aware about what I'm going to talk about briefly. But knowledge obviously isn't just information that we create or co-create. It's more so in what or how to value things, or in what to do, how to be, um, and even potentially embodied in social structures or patterns or organizations. And that's really what I got from Mark's talk, actually. That's why I mentioned this word, systems phenomenology. This idea that knowledge is kind of embedded in social structures. Like, I remember, Mark, you gave the example of, I think it was like a certain table that was like at a certain length because it helps to facilitate a spiritual engagement with it. So considering, I guess, knowledge in these other ways, and it's just one potential example of the deepening of the three. Um, and I guess these are some of the themes of knowledge production, which is part of the common sense, I guess, to to use that phrase, which I think is very rich, and I'll bring it up a little bit later. But I do really like that phrase, Martin, common sense. These are maybe some of the common sense ways that knowledge production is considered, more so in academia, I guess. And we're not really kind of in this academic uh, zone. So I think we're all pretty aware that we probably don't fall into the, or um, I mean, maybe we might in some ways. But these are kind of more um, kind of, if we're considering the shift in um, yeah, this in scientific paradigm, this is kind of the paradigm that maybe we're leaving a little bit. Um, and I think the phrase that sums it up best is this idea of epistemological delirium from Latour. I really like this phrase. This idea that it's a delirium. I think it makes a lot of sense. I think he personally kind of hit the nail on the head with that phrase. And the way that he uses it is basically just this idea that knowledge production is decontextualized, and there's kind of this overconfidence in our ability to know things in kind of yeah, in this particular kind of way that I guess science is the answer, and specialized knowledge is the answer. Um, so I guess the things that I'll try and bring up today are kind of moving past this, or potential ways to consider moving past this, or just kind of opening the discussion for moving past this, and maybe even considering this better. So just very briefly on, not sure if you can see the edge of that side there, but yeah, something Jonah brought up the a few sessions ago, just trying to consider the relationship of scientific paradigms and cultural paradigms. Um, yeah, this is, I guess, probably a question that we'll often consider or kind of come back to, but how to make sense of this intersection of how the two are connected, and how it makes sense to kind of speak about them or consider them maybe as happening at the same time or on different levels, and um, in which cases is it more appropriate to consider one or the other? These kinds of questions. So how are the two connected, and how to make sense of maybe their, yeah, connections or feedbacks or differences. And I think there was a discussion on this, and um, that's something that, yeah, would be interesting to kind of continue, and is what I'm going to touch on today a little bit. Um, and one thing that I personally forgot to bring up last session, Jonah, during that discussion, I think this idea of epistem might be pretty interesting, from Foucault, and just this idea that knowledge is culturally produced, or culturally, socially, historically produced. So there's always this kind of context. And it also, so I feel like he might, I'm not too deep into him, but he might have an interesting way of considering the intersection of cultural paradigm and scientific paradigm. So it might be an interesting thing to look into. And I know that he doesn't have the exact same, he doesn't tell the same story that we're used to, the exact same story of cultural change and scientific change, but it's very similar. Maybe in the future we can have a more in-depth discussion about it, but um, it's kind of, yeah, might be a good insight into how these two are connected. But I guess the question that I would like to pose, or I think would be interesting to consider with all these kinds of, considering this kind of context, um, is this kind of epistemic change or transformation, or this, yeah, scientific paradigm shift, one of a shift that's from greater understanding to depth of being. And yeah, so I guess that's probably the main question that I would like to kind of get in our minds, or suggest, or have us think about a little. Is this kind of the paradigm shift, or I don't want to say like one way to consider a paradigm shift in scientific transformation or change, and how that might even relate to cultural paradigm change. So is this question valuable to us for considering these kinds of shifts? Is it a shift of understanding to depth of being? Which brings up the question, what is the aim, I guess, of knowledge production? And if so, how to make sense of this shift? What does it look like? And how to consider it? And I guess how to consider it at the intersection of being, knowing, and valuing. And also just the question, what does it mean? What is depth of being even refer to? And I guess here kind of maybe I think we all maybe have a bit of an idea, but I'm kind of just suggesting that it's like more life, more ability or capacity for societal self-renewal. Um, yeah, so I guess this question, what is the aim of knowledge production? Yeah, is kind of one thing to unpack if we consider this question of a shift from greater understanding to depth of being. Um, Let me see. Yeah, so I guess I will kind of try and suggest a few things which have been suggested by others, and kind of offer a working concept or two to kind of consider this potential uh, transformation or change from, yeah, greater understanding to depth of being. And I see that there's something in the chat. I'm just making sure. Um, okay, I'll come back to these at the end because I don't have the time to read them all right now. Interesting. Hmm. Um, yeah, we can definitely consider that as we open up the discussion for sure. Um, all right, so the first thing is this idea of practice or ecologies of practice, which I think all of us are probably pretty familiar with, so I won't focus on it too much. But yeah, this idea that knowledge isn't about creating information, but about kind of embodying practices and what that means, how it's embedded in certain organizations or routines and patterns, and seeing practices as ways that knowledge is, I guess, enacted, used, is transformative or a part of these sociocultural structures. Um, and that practice is one way to consider this intersection of being, knowing, and valuing. That it's kind of a way to consider knowing, because you need certain knowledge to do a practice, I guess. It is kind of uh, ontological in nature, a practice, and it's you have to value certain things while you practice something. And it's, I guess, yeah, one way to think about it. And yeah, and it's also both a useful perspective kind of on a conceptual level, but also um, considering it in practice, how we think about our own practices or um, embodying this idea of practice. Um, Another potential way to think about it, which struck me very, very recently. So I didn't even really consider developing this too much or thinking about it too much, but I think this idea of ontological basin might be interesting. Just kind of throwing it out there as a working concept. See if it lands with anybody. If not, um, but we'll see. We'll see. But it's just one way to consider depth of being, I guess, because it's if we're thinking about a shift from a greater understanding to depth of being, how do you even really consider depth of being and what that means? It's a bit vague. We all have kind of an intuitive idea, but it's hard to kind of consider it or have concept. I mean, perhaps some people think it's not as difficult to consider, but personally, I think there aren't as many concepts or ways to think about it. So this is maybe one potential working concept to consider, depth of being. at different scales, kind of seeing it, um, being is always in a kind of basin, whether it's like a person or a city or a social field, maybe. Um, and depending on the nature of it, it kind of opens up certain possibilities of interaction or experience. So it's kind of the state of your being, as well as that your ability to cultivate being. So it's kind of that interaction. And I guess one way to consider it is that it's the possibilities, patterns, and textures of being and interaction. Perhaps that might seem a bit contextual or conceptual, but kind of just looking for a concept that refers to, yeah, how we can talk about being or how to consider being in different ways without it being too, I guess, quantitative, and without just saying it's deeper. Um, so maybe this is a potential working concept, and I think you could also consider it at different levels because I personally have always had trouble trying to pick apart or explain the difference between American cities and European cities. But to me, there's like a, an ex a fundamental difference between the two, between American cities and European cities. There's kind of more being, there's more interaction, there's more possibility in European cities. I mean, more or less, that's obviously a generalization, but that's my feeling from where I've lived. This is kind of one way to potentially consider the concept. I think it might be interesting to consider it going back to, yeah, Christopher Alexander, how certain kinds of architecture might facilitate more, I guess, being or possibilities. And maybe even George Kelly, your favorite person, Simon, and maybe personal constructs might be ways to consider, or we might say like have different ontological basins. I'm kind of just spitballing here. But I also wonder how Bordeaux might consider the concept. Because I know he talks about being as it relates to capital. So, or yeah, I guess being is kind of central to his framework. So I wonder how he might consider um, a concept like this, or how he talks about depth of being. I remember you saying it's, if I'm correct, Martin, it's about how much is that being is about how much. Um,
And do you want me to respond now, or you want to wait?
yeah, I guess you could just very quickly.
Yeah, I was just going to say that for me, the easiest way to think of being is how you're showing up in the world.
Hmm.
And the idea is if you don't act, if you don't engage, if you do not relate, you don't exist. And the qualification of your being is the amount of value that you produce. So
Mm-hmm.
unless what you're doing produces value, you are not being. So,
Mm.
so I'm actually happy with that so far. The only problem is that, for example, Viktor Frankl introduces this idea that you can passively acquire being, so one of his values, and that means that you can internally create value. And
Mm.
unfortunately, that kind of throws my idea into disarray. But I'm not actually like happy taking that into account. I'd much rather if it
Mm.
was simpler like that. The
Mm.
the value being produced externally, so you have to orient yourself in such way in order to earn that value.
Mm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting. Um, yeah, interesting. Definitely a conversation to be continued. But yeah, thank you. That helps clear things up. Um, let's see, it's 5:33. I don't think I'll talk about these too much. This was just kind of a way to consider it a little more. Um, yeah, just this idea that different maybe sociocultural arrangements might also have different ways to consider or to facilitate interactions of being. Um, but let me jump to the next point. the third one. So first was the emphasis on practice, second on ontological basin or something like that. And third, common sense and practical sense. And I must, I was quite surprised to hear common sense being brought up in the talk last week. But I thought it was really interesting how Bordeaux uses it, and I guess I looked into it a little bit, and I guess there are a lot of different interpretations of what common sense is, and how to consider, what it means. Um, but I guess just to sum up a little bit, from my understanding of how Bordeaux considers common sense, it depends on the agreed upon norms established by a dominant kind of ideology. But it stands in for what people kind of consider and take as obvious. It's not natural, but it's established and maintained. Maybe it changes slightly over time by whoever is in power. And a lot of, I guess, intellectuals um, tend to embody the system they come from. So don't really, see their way out of the labyrinth. Um, and mystification also kind of makes it harder to recognize. Um, and there was I think one way to even consider it again maybe is this idea of like culture in a biological sense, where like you grow up in a certain field and it kind of informs, what kind of person you become in a way. But I think this is a really rich concept. And yeah, the dialogue on the forum was really nice, and I think can be continued. But I would suggest that this interpretation of common sense is also one way of considering this interaction of knowing, valuing, knowing, being, knowing, valuing, I guess. Might even be interesting to think about it as an ecology of practices, maybe. Maybe not. I'm not sure how Bourdieu would consider that framing, but maybe. Um, but I guess the important thing is how can we reflect on our own common sense and what we take as being obvious, and if we think it, um, if we think we want to or we think it's needed, how do we embody new forms of being? Um, but it also has many different definitions throughout history. I guess you brought up Gramsci, Martin, the other day, and kind of the way he considers good sense versus common sense, which there's kind of an exchange between the two. There's some good sense and common sense. From what I can read, I'm still kind of uh, becoming familiar with it. So, but also, um, Arendt apparently considers common sense in terms of more of a political framing, like it's your ability for political action and to sense and be mindful of what's good for, I guess, the whole in terms of political um, processes. Apparently Aristotle and John Dewey kind of considered it in more of a like your rational intuition. It's just common sense. 2 + 2 = 4. Um, Rain also had a bit of a different interpretation. Apparently, it kind of focusing on what we see as common, what we might consider as being common. And I guess in um, depending on what culture you're in, you probably have a different sense of what counts as common. And this is by no means kind of like an exhaustive uh, understanding of all the different definitions or even these ones, but this is kind of just kind of just showing some other interpretations of it, which might also be interesting to consider when considering Bordeaux. But yeah, I guess I thought it was interesting because I was thinking about talking about it here. But referring to common sense kind of as like we always say that like there are certain capacities that are needed. And I kind of wanted or needed to kind of and I want to be careful about the framing here, but kind of just move things forward or coexist with others. And I was interested in kind of using common sense this way. Like common sense is just like the basic capacities and orientation for maybe for cultivation of being. But it's more of an aspirational definition, maybe more like in the Arendt sense. But just kind of this basic capacity to exist with others. And I kind of mean it in this way because we often, yeah, um, yeah, kind of have an idea of the capacities we might need, but don't have a word for it necessarily. But I think it might be interesting just to consider this in terms of it's common sense to do certain things. Um, the definition of it might change a little bit, what it requires, but some quick brainstorming, just um, the ability to recognize and be guided by what's good, true, and beautiful, maybe, is perhaps one way to think about it. Also just a general optimism, kind of just the ability to, oh yeah, one thing that I liked is this idea of omni-harmonization. I forget who brought it up, but kind of just this idea to uh, that whatever context you're in, you kind of let the context grow and evolve. So that's kind of the way I was thinking about bringing up common sense. Um, so it might be interesting. Well, it might be interesting to consider how to reconcile these potentially two different definitions. Um, some other, I guess, ways to consider it, just understanding that we're all human beings. Um, yeah, and I guess all that entails from that. Is it more so learned or is it more so emergent? Maybe it's similar to good sense from Gramsci a little bit. Um, but these are just some very quick brainstorming things. Want to wrap up soon, but I guess the reason why I thought it might be interesting is to contrast it with practical sense. You have common sense or aspirational common sense, where you can recognize what's good, true, and beautiful in like a general way, but it practical sense more so refers to like specific practices. So, for example, I was kind of thinking about this. I recently went to Cordoba and some guy like brews coffee there. So practical sense for him would be, knowing when to brew the beans, how to brew the beans, and these kinds of things. But it's not everyone needs to know that. It's not common sense. But he would still have common sense in terms of just general basic interaction and things like that. But this practical sense more so referring to specific practices that we might be involved in that not necessarily everybody is involved in. Let me see. I will yeah, and I guess it might be interesting to consider this aspirational common sense as kind of a mediator within and across practical sense. The two are obviously not clearly divided or not clearly divided, but kind of feed into each other. And might even be able to, you might think of it as a way to, that education is about developing these things. And I guess I think I'll end here because it took a little bit longer than I expected. But yeah, this final point was just about re-wondering or wondering more deeply about this transition. So I will, yeah, that's it for now. I'll curious to hear if anyone has any comments or feedback or what people are feeling or yeah. things of that nature. Mhm. Yeah, Mark, please go ahead. I think
Thanks a lot. Yes, and I have to go, unfortunately, very soon. So I'll be short, but yeah, I like a lot your positioning. I think there's a lot to be gained from what anthropologists have been uncovering into ways of knowing, and has they've kind of accommodated to that, and a lot also from the decolonial literature and the feminist literature around these topics, which I think is interesting. And I wanted to mention, with your notion of aim of knowing, it's been interesting for me to see, when aim is soteriological, for example, which means like salvation, which is a depth of being, and that's more like unlearning modes. So like looking at your axioms and going for, rather than the hypothetical deductive kind of plunging into objective world, is the axiomatic kind of restructuring, or maybe destructuring. And I pointed out in the chat, that's a bit kind of where Vervaeke is going with this reverse engineering of the dialogos, which is kind of how do you balance that kind of looking like group self-reflexivity as an approach to align axioms and align perspectives, while at the same time engaging with intersectional perspectives once you've set the alignment. And I think the balance between the both might be, that activity of the new researcher, which is, this kind of balance between non-dual and dual aspects. So it might be interesting to look at this kind of perspectival realist literature also, and the reverse engineering of dialogos literature.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, thanks for those recommendations. Please feel free to email them over. But yeah, I guess you have to go. And it probably take more time for me to metabolize all that and give a good response. But
we can go a little. Please leave a little message if you're.
Sure. Yeah, that sounds good.
Okay. And I have to go to my next meeting. It was great to see you. Yes, thanks a lot.
But yeah, I guess very quickly, I just wanted to add that, yeah, I think I don't know exactly what re-engineering the dialogos, I think that's what he said. But just talking about things differently, I think, is a very important and interesting point. But yeah, Jonah.
You're muted, Jonah. I believe you're muted.
Sorry, yeah, because I just wanted to come in on the mention of Vervaeke. I was thinking he's very relevant as well. And yeah, I'm not quite sure what Mark had in mind, but the way I was understanding the connection was around Vervaeke's sort of different types of knowledge that he talks about. So you've got propositional knowledge, which kind of aligns with the scientific paradigm part of your talk, I guess. And then different kinds of knowledge going down to participatory knowledge, which aligns more, I guess, with cultural paradigms or common sense or being, I'm assuming, as well. And I guess what I find interesting about Vervaeke's perspective is that, as I read him, there's sort of two-way interaction between those. So it's not just that, as Foucault says, culture informs science and sort of provides the context for science, but it's also that science informs culture, and so the propositional knowledge can have an impact on your sort of cultural experience on being. And I take that as being sort of part of what research is for, in the sense that that's, we're engaged in propositional knowledge in a talk like this, but we're aiming to have an impact on participatory knowledge or being. And so, yeah, I think that's a sort of useful way of navigating beyond the sort of postmodernism of Foucault, but also recognizing the importance of being.
Yeah, that's a good point. I always did prefer Vervaeke's, I guess, typology. but yeah, I think it's a really important conversation to have. And I don't necessarily want to say like Vervaekes is the um the only one, but maybe there are others too. But I think, and just for example, one of my PhD advisors kind of has like a similar typology, but I always kind of reference Vervaekes, and but or in those conversations I reference Vervaekes, but I think it's I think it's one of the most a very interesting conversation and important conversation to have, because there are different types of knowing, but it's not really I guess talked about in a way that is makes a lot of sense, or is embodied really. So I think deepening that conversation, trying to figure out what these different ways of knowing are, how they interact, is really important. Yes, I mean.
Once I've found the unmute button. Thank you. Yeah, really nice, stimulating presentation, Matthew. Thank you for that. As you might guess, I'm kind of, and as I've commented, I'm graduating from common to commons or commoned or commoning. I mean, my sense, is it modernism or is it capitalism that's polarization that's actually fragmented common sense? I mean, I'm questioning whether common sense is a useful concept anymore because of the way in which it's sort of like deeply fragmented and individualized. And so that brings me on to the whole idea of commoning, or if you like, recommoning, if you like. How can we common sense? How can we do, the common as a verb? How can we do commoning of common sense? How can we regenerate common sense by a process of commoning? And I think that's something I'd love to. I mean, I don't have answers to that. Well, perhaps I do, but I mean, I've got tentative ideas, not answers. But I'd love to. That's something I'd love to investigate more. That for me, more than a sort of abstract analysis of what common sense means, I would like to look at the process of commoning and all that kind of related to that.
Yeah, nice. I agree. I think common sense, and more than like more than seeing it in like an abstract way, is really interesting, and how it might be considered, or redeveloped. I often feel like I need to like really sit with the comments to give them a good answer. But yeah, no, I completely agree with what you're saying. I think it's really interesting. And how do we even how do we consider common sense, and I guess apply it? And these are all kind of interesting questions for me.
Great. Well, let's look forward to looking at that some other place, some other time. Great. Thanks.
Yeah, Martin.
I just wanted to comment on this different definition of common sense that you mentioned, Gramsci and Bourdieu. And I don't believe there is any difference in terms of what ontologically common sense means. But what Bourdieu was working on and what he uncovered is that common sense is a blind spot, and it's a weapon for promoting views, dominant views in the society. And it also is a logical fallacy, if you can think of it that way, because it tries to pass something as common sense. So it's almost kind of like a mechanism for manufacturing common sense that is actually not common sense. So that is kind of like my idea. So it's a weapon of mystification, and it's an important part of it that academia has in disseminating these dominant views as common sense views, but they're not. Clearly, they're not. And that's also the role of the state, because the state is that kind of node that controls this triangle between the dominant class and itself as dissemination and the society. And Gramsci, I don't think he's got a different view of what common sense means, because he's a Marxist a philosopher as well. So he understands that there is some manipulation there, but he, I think, expresses hope that it's possible to cultivate common sense. And I don't know on what basis he's doing, but so that's kind of my opinion. But I think the main thing is to try to gain awareness of the fact that what common sense is said to be most often is not. So I think that is kind of like direction where you want to go, to try to see how you can get out of this binds of the structure and realize that. Thanks.
Yeah, that's interesting. I wonder, I haven't read this book, but I wonder if I think it's Ideology and State Apparatus, I think it might be called. Might be interesting to look into as well. And how, yeah, but I I feel like this concept of common sense has so many different potential angles. Nicholas, are you saying something?
I'm
There's
sorry, I've
background,
got to
Nicholas'
go
background.
actually. Sorry.
No problem. See you. Yeah, that's it. Yeah, it kind of also reminds me of this idea. I forget who said it, but I don't want to say the wrong thing here, but you always kind of have to justify certain kinds of power. Like it has to be justified. You can't just, if you don't justify it and you kind of just accept it, then probably is not very commonsensical, maybe. But yeah, I feel like there's so much to this concept, and I think that's, yeah, one of the things personally I'd like to explore in the group a little more. What what are the different ways of considering common sense? How might we want to think about it or have dialogue about it? Does it refer to specific capacities? Things like that. Yeah, I think it's definitely more of an ongoing conversation for sure. But I'm wondering, it's about 5:57. I'm wondering if you wanted to do a quick checkout. Yeah. Would anybody like to go first? Yeah.
Sure, I'd like to just